We're going to continue with our discussion on the sociology of deviance. We're going to work on segment 2 now, compare and contrast definitions of deviance in under 5 minutes. One of the first and easiest ways to study deviance from a sociological perspective is by using the absolutist definition. This definition defines deviance as pertaining to some external moral code or law. In this case, deviant behavior is not contingent upon things like context or place or time, so it doesn't matter who or when or where or under what circumstance the behavior was committed. What is defined as deviant will always be deviant. You have to think about the short term. A crime is a crime is a crime is a crime. Deviant behavior is going to be deviant at all times, places, and contexts under this definition. It assumes everyone agrees on an obvious basic rules of society, but the problem with the absolutist definition is that it ignores many facets of social life. We can already see or think about instances where some behavior may or may not be considered deviant dependent on where it takes place, who's doing it, what period of history or what even time of day the behavior is occurring. We see lots of examples, or we can use lots of evidence from things like religious texts or even law to find absolutist definitions of deviant behavior, which often, or at least much of the time, includes moral implications for that behavior. Sociologists also use what's called the statistical definition of deviant behavior, which is really defining deviance by rarity or frequency of occurrence of particular types of behavior. Rather than emphasizing what is moral or what is not moral, this particular definition focuses on rates that is typically outside the normal distribution of occurrence for that behavior. So we note as sociologists that much of human behavior, in fact, occurs on what we would call a bell curve, in which there is a portion of the population in which a particular rarity or frequency of events occur, and then there is on the tails of the bell curve a portion of the population for any particular type of behavior that does that behavior more frequently than the norm or less frequently than the norm. So we can think about examples such as daily hand washing as falling on a continuum. One study shows that an average number of times reported for hand washing is about 10 times per average. About 1% of the population say that they wash their hands once or less per day, and then about 1% of the population says that they wash their hands 50 or more times a day. So, we have a normative distribution of hand washing behavior, and the statistical definition doesn't ask us to really look into or explain hand washing as being right or wrong. We can just look at hand washing behavior as either being normative number of hand washing, an excess of hand washing, or a excess of not washing one's hands. Aside from the statistical definition of deviant behavior, we can use the normative definition, which is defined by identifying the normative expectations for behavior within a group and observing or measuring when these expectations are transgressed or broken. The normative definition provides a means for measurement of certain behaviors, as well as focuses on this cultural meaning. So it has this kind of added element that the statistical definition doesn't bring to it. However, it doesn't account for whether the norm violation was viewed as deviant by others within that social context. So the normative definition doesn't necessarily focus on social context as much as we may like. So we need to use an additional definition for that. Which brings us to the reaction definition, which defines deviance as a reaction of an audience that views a behavior as either being deviant or not deviant. Rather than focusing on the norms itself, it takes into account the greatest extent the social context by focusing on how an audience may view behaviors as deviant or not deviant. The only problem with the reactionist definition is that it doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that typically social norms are part of why an audience will react in a negative way. So sociologists may compare similar behaviors across groups to see under what circumstances that behavior is considered deviant or not deviant. And it may also compare them across time or across context as well. That concludes our exploration of definitions of deviance.